Good evening, everyone. I think we've got just a few people who haven't got their seats yet. We'll get started shortly. Well, welcome along, everyone, and thank you for attending. It's great to see a mix of old and new faces here and to return to another year of networking and learning together. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us tonight. I'd also like to especially welcome our speaker, Kirsty Robertson, and I'll introduce her shortly. Women in Aid and Development, which is hosting this evening's event, is a membership organisation for all women who work in or aspire to work in the international development and humanitarian sectors, inclusive of trans women and non-binary people. We're part of a global community of women in aid, and we'd love for you to join us in celebrating women across the sector, sharing our experiences and supporting and inspiring each other to pursue and succeed in leadership roles today and into the future. You can connect with us and women at all levels in the sector by engaging in conversations on our Facebook page and on LinkedIn. And if you hear anything or learn anything tonight, especially interesting that you'd like to share, please tag us on social media. My name's Michelle Imison, my pronouns are she, her, and I'll be facilitating this evening's session. I'm an international development consultant with particular interests in public health, gender, research and advocacy. I've worked and volunteered all over the sector, in academia and a couple of different parts of the world. I'm also a member of Women in Aid and Development's Events Committee, which meets regularly to discuss ideas for these events and to find speakers. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow Sydney leaders who are here this evening, as well as board members and our chair, Chris Franks, who is doing all the things, including right now taking photos of us all. She does everything. So some quick housekeeping before we start. The bathrooms are around to your right. You might have seen them already, and the exit behind us up here to my left. Actually, that's your right. Please help yourself to food and drinks throughout the event this evening, and do stay on afterwards for more networking in person with other participants and with our speaker. And our session tonight's being recorded. We'll share that with you afterwards. You can listen back again or share it with other people as well. So we'll be hearing from Kirsty and then have time for questions. I'll be guiding our discussion, but of course most of our questions will come from you. So as you're listening, please keep in mind any burning issues that come up for you. So today, as we're probably all aware, is the eve of International Women's Day, a global day to celebrate women's economic, social, cultural and political achievements, as well as being an opportunity to take stock of how far we still have to go to achieve gender equality and equity. Among other strands in its history, IWD grew out of labour struggles and the fight for women's suffrage, and it bears repeating that it remains a political event. This year's official theme in Australia for IWD is Cracking the Code, Innovation for a Gender Equal Future, which foregrounds the importance of bold ideas, inclusive technology and accessible education in combating discrimination, disrupting outdated ideas about women's place in society, and overcoming the marginalisation of women and girls globally. And these multifaceted challenges show up in quite specific ways in our sector. Indeed, Women in Aid and Development's event in October last year focused exactly on new technologies in aid, development and the humanitarian sectors. And some recent stats highlight a couple of the aspects of this challenge. So globally, there are around 250 million fewer women online than men, and 327 million fewer women than men have access to a smartphone and to mobile internet. Women hold only 2 in every 10 of the world's science, engineering and ICT jobs. In 2019, global funding to female-led startups was just 2.8%. And in 2020, it fell to 2.3%. Although it's worth saying that women make up 58% of Africa's self-employed population, and they're more likely than men to become entrepreneurs. And closer to home, in 2022, the eSafety Commissioner reported that 75% of Australian adults had had at least one negative online experience. And I will note that I was pretty amazed to see that that top line figure in this research wasn't actually broken down by gender, and I suspect that if it had been, we would have seen some even starker results than that. So to dig into all this and to talk about career building, the choices and challenges that's entailed and the support that's made a difference, I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Kirsty Robertson. Kirsty grew up in Castle Hill here in Sydney and studied for her Bachelor of Economics and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. She now also holds a graduate certificate in Catholic Culture and Leadership from the Australian Catholic University and a Master of Arts in Cultural Anthropology from Macquarie University. Kirsty began her career in the sector at Caritas Australia, and over the years she's worked at the Anglican Board of Mission, Force 10, who's now Act for Peace, as a consultant, and she was for 5 years the CEO of Mary MacKillop Today. She's lived, worked and travelled in over 50 countries, including in Ethiopia, where she worked with the development arm of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and in Nepal, where she was looking into the protection of the rights of porters for the International Porters Protection Agency. She came back to Caritas Australia in September 2019 to become the organisation's first female CEO. So feels doubly right for us to be speaking to you tonight. Throughout her career, Kirsty's dedicated herself to tackling the big issues like poverty, injustice and inequality. She's especially dedicated to improving outcomes for women and girls around the world, and she believes that we all have a responsibility to provide support and compassion so that all women can reach their full potential. We're looking forward to hearing more from you about all of this. Thank you, Kirsty.
Fabulous. Yay! Bring on the cheers. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle, for the lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know there are other things that you could most definitely be doing this hot Tuesday evening, and so it's nice to see some new faces and some reasonably old Caritas ones who've come on to be my cheering squad. I was just saying before to some of you that being a CEO is sometimes a bit of a lonely job. Now, I'm not going to go poor me, but it is sometimes a bit lonely, and it was quite lovely for me just to see the number of Caritas people who've come out tonight. So, yeah, hats off to you. Yeah, like it's very interesting, I think, being asked to speak. And when I was trying to think of some notes, I've got about a few more speaking events this week for International Women's Day. And it's really interesting for me in the role that I have and in the organisation that I work for to be talking about women on International Women's Day. Those of you who don't know Caritas Australia, Caritas Australia is the international aid and development agency of the Catholic Church. And if you read the Sydney Morning Herald yesterday, there was an article in there where the headline was essentially Catholic women disgruntled or fighting about their role in the church. And you know, so there's probably some irony in the fact that I'm here speaking today, or perhaps in a way, you know, that's part of my story and also part of the story of Caritas. As Michelle said right at the start, Caritas is an organisation that's about 60 years old. We turn 60 next year. And when I was appointed 3 years ago, I was the first female CEO of the organisation. And it, you know, definitely caused a little bit of a stir in many fronts. I've spoken many times before about some of the things that were said to me during that time, but perhaps I'll just share a few. The first, and I actually still keep this message on my phone just to remind me of the way that some people think. The first was a message from a reasonably prominent man in Australia who sent a message saying, "Congratulations, Kirsty, there are a lot of men who will be able to help you do this job." Very interesting. Thanks for that. I appreciate your support. It was my polite response. And I think as well, like, you know, just a spectrum of letters from some supporters, as well as from people in the wider community within we work, who were questioning, I think, the ability of a woman to run an organisation the size of Caritas. At the time, I had a 2-year-old son. And, you know, how was I going to work? How was that going to work? What was going to happen to my child while I was travelling? How is this possible? Now remember, this is just 3.5 years ago, guys. Like this is not a conversation we're having about something that happened 50 years ago. And these are the sorts of conversations at every turn. It was like, well, who's looking after your child? It's like, well, did you ask the man who held the job before me what was happening to his kids? No. And so really interesting space, I think, for me to be into during those first sort of couple of months in the role. And so I would say, you know, if you look at the sector more broadly now, certainly when I started out in this space 25 years ago or something, there was very few female CEOs. You know, now we can see, and you only have to turn up to an ACFID event these days, you know, you can see the volume of female CEOs. So you can see a definite change taking place in the sector during that time. But it's still a journey. It's still a journey that we're all on, I think, as a broader sector and as conversations within our organisation about that trajectory path for women in our space. And there still are some significant hurdles for us to, I think, all keep having good conversations about and good dialogue about. So I think, again, as Michelle said, my first job after graduating from university was actually with Caritas. So I have literally held the most junior job in the organisation, and now I'm the CEO, which again, interesting, I think interesting career. Sometimes I think, oh, I'm back here again. How did that happen? But also I think provides some interesting insight into running an organisation. I would say now at Caritas, I'm really proud of the diversity that we have on our staff, on our leadership team, on our board. And I think that diversity is largely the result of the vision of the people who went before me. And we now bear the fruits, or we see the fruits of that, that investment and that commitment to diversity. And I think for me personally, I would also like to say that I think in the career that I've had and the choices that I've made, it's largely been the support of men who've actually enabled me, who've pushed me forward, who've encouraged me to lean in. And I realise that's not perhaps what people would expect me to say, but it certainly has for me not been about the support of other women. It has most definitely been the support of men, and certainly when the job of CEO of Caritas came up, it was the men in my life who were like, Kirsty, you know, apply for that job. And at the time, Jack de Groot, the ex-CEO of Vinnie's and the ex-CEO of Caritas, rang me, and I was like, no, that's ridiculous, you know, not the job for me. And I remember his words, it was just like, you know, men always think they're better than they are, and women always think that they're, you know, not capable. And normally the reverse is true. So he was just like, just listen to me. And so I think it's really interesting. I think it's really interesting that I've definitely felt the support of men on this journey. And I now work with amazing men too, who are in the audience tonight. So hats off to you, gentlemen. And so I guess my reflection is the place of women supporting women, and how now that I am in a leadership role myself, how I can lean into that responsibility. I would say, as much as I've had the support of those men, obviously, there's been some interesting interactions, and certainly the outside world of the church within Caritas operates, and the outside world of, you know, the planet more broadly certainly pokes its head into the life of Caritas and the life of the work that we do, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But, you know, for me, sometimes those things annoy me, but normally they amuse me. Normally I try and find some amusement out of people's, I'm going to say, lack of knowledge, for trying to find a polite way to describe some of these interactions. And so, and you know, I guess that's just my way of internalising it or dealing with it, so that I don't take those things, those things personally. But also I think for me it's about when I did get the job initially, and there was a lot of talk about me being a woman, it was also a bit of a moment of me going, you know what, this is an opportunity. And as we all know, poverty has a woman's face. Here's my opportunity to turn these conversations into a conversation about women, about the experience that they have worldwide and the experience that marginalised people have in the countries where Caritas Australia is working. And, you know, I still think it's astounding, any of the statistics, and you read some out, Michelle, with regards to women, that it really is, it's still an area that we have to progress here in Australia, and it certainly is an area that we're still discussing in our organisations, and that's 25 years after I first entered this sector. And I can see some of us who've been around for a while nodding with that. And so for me, that then calls a question mark about how we can accelerate this change. Because after 2.5 decades of plodding on like this, to be honest, I'm starting to have enough. And I think there's a number of women in the sector who are a bit like, let's make a move. Let's think about these questions in terms of transformational change. And so that probably brings us to some of the conversations tonight, and the conversation around gender equity and innovation more broadly. And there's certainly some irony in asking me to talk about innovation, and people who work with me would know this. I'm not a natural innovator, but I'd like to be. So can I be an aspirational innovator for tonight's conversation? And you know, it's really interesting. When I got the notes for tonight, I was reflecting a little bit on this. I talk about innovation a lot. I talk about agility a lot, and I try, but it's hard, right? Like, you know, I think it's not easy. It's not easy for me. And in a way, I think maybe that makes me an interesting speaker on the topic, because I can certainly tell you how not to progress this. So I would say innovation interests me because transformational change interests me. Because I do think for us as a sector, we've had an interesting journey. And, you know, if I look at my experience at Caritas, I first walked in the door as a 19-year-old, and I returned as a 40-something-year-old, and a lot of the things were still exactly the same, you know, literally. But, you know, we're still working our way through project cycles. We're still doing project designs the way that we have always done them. Gosh, at Caritas, we were still sitting in the same seats that we were in with the same office layout. And so, yes, you know, part of that is about an organisation and, you know, its previous leadership and whatever. But actually, as a sector, things not necessarily moving too much either. And if you look at us as a sector and the way we fund within the sector, the way we create projects for, you know, ANCP or any of the other partnerships under DFAT, you know, a lot of this has remained the same for 2 decades longer. And so I think there is this really fundamental question that's sort of burning in the bellies of many of us of going, do we still want to be here in 2 decades' time? Is now the time for some radical thinking? Which then, of course, leads us to innovation, not my strength. So, you know, but I think not necessarily the sector's strength either. So, you know, I think therein sort of lies some of my thinking is, well, I always used to talk to development professionals. If you want to see my house on the weekend, most of my friends work in development. And, you know, you've probably, after 25 years in this space, you've lost most of your other friends, because every second week you're flying to Ethiopia and they're like, you know, what's going on here? The only people who really understand that life are people who work in aid and development. And so, but, you know, over the last couple of years, and certainly in the lead up to my role at Caritas, started to think, what's happening? And some of my friends left and worked in venture capital. Others went and worked in various sort of, like, I'd say sort of tech worlds. And that started to get interesting to me because, you know, in those sorts of worlds, things are moving very fast and scalable initiatives are really taking form. And so I think for me, there was something in peeking over the fence, in looking at what's happening in other sectors right now and wondering how we can translate that into the work that we do in development. And about this time as well, I think, you know, for me personally, most of my friends were off having children. And I call myself an accidental CEO because I sort of became a CEO while I was waiting to have a child. So I was sort of like, that took me 12 years, so it was a bit of a journey. But, you know, as I was waiting to have a child, I was like, oh yeah, here's another job, or lean into this. But it also taught me a little bit about this sort of agile thinking, because in the back of my mind, I was always going, I'll just get this project done and then I'll have a baby. Yeah, but sort of 12 years went past. So in that time, I got a lot of projects done. And I was always under the pump because I was sure the next month I was going to be pregnant and have a baby. And so the result was, I can see people laughing, but it's true. And so, you know, the result was I became quite effective during that time of like pumping out initiatives. Plus I didn't have a baby, so it meant that I could really lean into, you know, to my career, and I wasn't necessarily doing the juggle that many women at that stage in their life were doing. But it also taught me a little bit about what I now know is that idea of sprinting, because I was effectively doing that in the way, you know, in the way that I was working. So, you know, so when I guess getting back to that idea of innovation in our sector, I think for me the first thing is how can we teach people in our sector, people like me who don't know anything about this, to learn. What can we learn from what's happening over the fence in other sectors, and how can we bring those ideas into our organisations? So, you know, for me at Caritas, we set up an impact department. We hired smart people, one sitting here, who can help get people like me to understand how we can look at transformational change and what that might mean for a development organisation like our own. And they're not easy conversations. We are, as a sector, have organisations that are very set up around project design, delivery, this sort of whole project cycle space, and to disrupt that is quite a difficult space to operate in. And I was reflecting with another CEO on this last week, and we're saying, you know, normally as a CEO, you're sort of having debates about strategy. But in this space, when you're trying to do, you know, big transformational change, you're actually having a debate internally in your organisations about ways of thinking. And that's much more threatening, particularly perhaps for people who've been in this space for a really long time. Lee's nodding here, going, yep. So, you know, I think it's a really interesting line to walk as organisations as we try and embrace this new thinking. I was reading the week before last a piece by Harvard Business on CEOs more broadly, so not in the not-for-profit sector, and a piece on, you know, 75% or so of executives had said innovation, agile thinking is the key to their organisation's success, but only 20% had actually done something about it. And, you know, I think I now realise, having trying to walk this myself in my own organisation, that's because that's a really hard path. It's a really difficult sort of leap for us as development agencies to make. And also I think as a sector, you know, certainly, you know, impact investment, yes. So there have been some changes, particularly around alternative finance. But actually moving into agile thinking and quite transformational level change is something that we haven't really seen take place here in Australia. And we do need to look across the fence for examples. So, you know, I think as well for me, there's a simplicity that So as well as, I guess, trying to do those big transformational projects, I think in my heart and in my story and in what I'm trying to achieve as both an individual as well as the CEO of Caritas, gets back to that sort of core mission of who I am, and also just trying to walk alongside an individual in poverty in a country far away from my own. And so, you know, for me, it's about being able to balance those two pieces of this puzzle, to never lose sight of that, you know, 40-year-old woman in Kenya who's learning to write her name for the first time, at the same time as I'm like, can we do massive transformational change in the sector or across the globe? And so I think that's a really interesting line for us to walk, both as individuals but also as organisations. How do we keep people at the centre of this? How do we keep individuals' stories at the centre of who we are? I thought it was interesting, Michelle, when you were reading out those statistics before. I have a friend who works in venture capital, and she was telling me that less than 2%, actually I think it was just over 2%, of venture capital goes to women. And then that got me interested in social impact investment. So just to be clear, there's a lot of gendered projects, but who's actually running them? Who's owning those organisations? Almost exclusively men. And so as I went down the rabbit hole of social impact, it's quite similar. So a lot of impact investment on women and projects around women, but most of the organisations are led by men. And so I just have a question mark in my head of going, are we repeating this same story all over again that we had in the NGO space here 2 decades or so ago? So I guess to conclude, or to summarise some of my thoughts, I think for me, I was saying to some people earlier, my son is now 6, and obviously I'm a geriatric mother, so I had him in my 40s, right? So it's interesting when you're sort of older at the school gate, and you have different thoughts, or I'm sure, than younger parents, is what's clear. I haven't yet been asked if I'm his grandmother, so that's a good start. But there's definitely an age difference between me and the average parent at the school gate. But it does also make me think about, I've got a 6-year-old boy, and what's my hope for him in the future and the way he relates to other men, but also to women. And, in many senses, he's lived an extraordinary life because he travelled a lot with me when he was younger. So his first trip overseas was to East Timor. He's been all around the world. And so he has this interesting international lens. But also in our household, he lives with not usual gender stereotypes. And so how can we set our boys up for a future in a world that's very different than perhaps the men that are living in today? And I think that's a really important question for us to ask, both here in Australia, but also with regards to our development projects overseas. What's the work that we're doing with men in this space to set them up for success as we move forward? And I guess my final thought is, COVID, as we know, definitely gave us a moment to pause and a moment to rethink. And but now it's starting to feel like we're crawling back into those old ways, right? When we first hit there, we were in this really disruptive space, and we were all like, oh, this is going to change things forever. And some things, ways of working perhaps, but we are creeping back into those old ways of doing. And I guess my question for myself, for my organisation, and more broadly for the International Caritas Confederation, which is our global arm, is, are we embracing that disruption enough? We have this amazing opportunity, and how are we leaning into the transformational possibilities that have emerged as part of a part of those conversations. And, you know, for us in the sector, why can't we dream big, you know? And particularly for us as women, we inherit this amazing time in the sector where, you know, the majority of the CEOs are women. We see women moving their way up through leadership. We have a real voice. Let's use it. Let's do something really, really powerful with this moment. Because otherwise it'll be lost. And, you know, I guess that's my challenge that I leave you with is what are you doing in the own spaces that you work and how big can you dream about different possibilities? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Chris, do we have another microphone for questions? I can't even see where she is. It's just the one. Okay. All right. Well, there'll be a bit of running around then. All right. So while you, I'm happy to have a go. Consultants do all kinds of things. So while you think of the questions that are formulating out of those burning thoughts you've had, I'm going to start with one question to give you a couple of minutes. Just to pull on so many threads in what you've just said. Now that you've been a CEO for a couple of years, does the phrase women's leadership mean something particular to you? Sounds like there's an answer there ready to go.
I mean, I do a lot of speaking on women's leadership. It's really funny, isn't it? I was asked in an interview the other day my thoughts on women's leadership, and it's a two-edged sword. Like, you know, I guess my first thought is, why does leadership have to be gendered? And I really don't think it needs to be. So can we just have a conversation about good leadership, about the value of diversity in leadership? Yeah, so that's my first reaction. You can tell. I guess I'm not a fan of this certain understanding of the way that women do things, and in fact, I think it's to our detriment as a group, as a collective, to look at some of those gender stereotypes, because in a way we're just continuing a stereotype, whether it's, you know, good or bad. And also I think there's a certain view that men do things some way and women do them the other, and I just fundamentally disagree. I've worked with some amazing inclusive men who have modelled some of the best leadership I've ever seen, and I don't think we should lose that in the conversation about leadership. So yeah, talk to me about good leadership, not women's leadership.
Excellent, thanks. Well, that's gotten the ball rolling. Any questions from the floor? If not, I get another question and I can keep going all night. So you're going to want to ask some questions. Excellent. Okay, and is that, Chris, is it okay for a questioner? We need, okay. When you give your question, do tell us who you are and where you're from. Thanks.
Hello. Jessica Stone from Caritas Australia. Kirsty, you mentioned big transformational projects and changing this sort of like project cycle, repetitive structure that we're in as an industry. Could you talk to that a little bit more? Because it's big and it's exciting, and I would like to hear what your thoughts are.
No, not at all. Not at all. You know, I think there's a few things, but I was recently at a meeting of the International Confederation. So Caritas Australia is part of an international confederation, the largest or second largest humanitarian agency in the world, so second to the Red Cross. So internationally, 160 something members. And I was just talking to the General Secretary about this very point when I was overseas a couple of weeks ago. And I guess there's some very practical examples. So for me, if you look, you asked a question about projects, so I'll give you an example with regards to projects. You know, I think as a sector, both here in Australia as well as globally, we've come to understand a project, the way it works, a certain amount of money that it takes. In general, for us in Australia, we look at a project around 250 grand a year to about 750 grand a year, because we've worked out that's about the efficiency model based on, you know, DFAT reporting and our fundraising initiatives and whatever else. But if you threw all of that out, what would be the most impactful project size? And globally, there's been some conversations on that in the Caritas Confederation. And interestingly, there's conversations about really big projects, so millions, tens of millions of dollars a year. But interestingly, the ones that appear most impactful, and hopefully this is part of the work that hopefully at some stage we can collect more data on as a confederation, is the ones that involve almost no money. And I think that's a really interesting piece for us as a sector. And certainly for us as an organisation, we often at Caritas speak a lot of our accompaniment model, so our commitment to walk alongside our partners. What does it mean if there's more value in that than the actual project that we're doing together? And how would that disrupt the way that we do development as a sector? So there's those sort of very practical, what I would call sort of development-y sort of questions. And then there's just some bigger, you know, questions about scalable ideas that I think often for us in the sector, we just can't get the capital together to scale what are really great on the ground projects. And I think this is where impact investment and alternative finance more broadly, but also, well, some of the ideas out of the tech sector are interesting because it's because I think we haven't been particularly successful at looking at scalability. Yeah. And I'm using we broadly, and I don't want to, because I'm sure that, you know, there are pockets of examples, but certainly if you read literature across the sector, it's not something that we have been particularly successful in. And I think that's threatening. You know, people get threatened by, you know, and certainly this shift in having other players in our space at the moment is a really interesting one. And so my opinion is, let's not fear that. Let's look at the opportunities of what we can bring into those conversations and what others might bring, because I think there's a lot we can learn from outside. Sorry, long answer.
Excellent. Love long answers. That's what you're here for. Next question. Yes, down the front.
Hi. Lee Matthews from Caritas. It's a comment question. I think I was just picking up on what you were saying about, I think, the sector's struggles with innovation, and thinking through that and thinking, like, even to have someone come in to talk to us as an organisation about innovation, there's a lot of work that has to go into what is the lens that you need to talk to us through, because it's not the same as business. We have a whole different set of things that we need to consider because of the nature of the work that we do. So I guess it's a bit of a different beast, innovation in the international development sector. But I think another part of it is that, like, if we step it right back to the people that work in development and their education, so people going through university, and we are trained to within an inch of our lives to work within a 3-year log frame, right? and so that's really like pounded in to people's ways of working and the way they think about projects and the cycle of them. And so it's really, really hard to come up out of that and think differently and think that there could be another way. So I guess I'm interested in how we overcome that kind of challenge in, we want really amazing people that are working in development, and we also want them to think differently and disrupt.
Yeah, I think it's just about creating space, right? You know, I think back to your point, like, yeah, I mean, we all have programs in our organisation that literally, you know, yell at you when the 6-month report isn't in. And so we are, you know, literally we've got systems around this beast of the way that these organisations work from a programs perspective. But even, I think, more compelling actually is the back end of NGOs. You know, most people think of running an NGO being about programs, but actually a lot of it is this back end work, HR, fundraising, communications, you know, that's all vital work for the ongoing organisation. And they're also working on their own, you know, cycle, spitting out the next direct mail. And so, you know, I think in one sense, you wish you could stop an organisation. I've certainly had these moments of going, could I just put a pause on all of this and then I could do my innovation over here, and wouldn't it be wonderful? But it's just not possible. And so I think part of it is about creating space. And I think part of that, you know, in Caritas, but also in my thinking, is about creating space in my mind. And I'm known for being quite particular about not having a meeting on a Monday, purposely so, because on a Monday I think. And I think it's really important that we remember to think, that we're not just working our way through the next cycle of things that we're pumping out. And I think that's really important for everyone. And if you don't already do it, I highly suggest it. But, you know, if you're not reading, if you're not expanding, if you're getting your head out of that cycle, there literally will never be any change in an organisation. But secondly, I think that our boards have something to play. And sorry, it was Tarina, I was talking to Tarina before, who's on the board of results. And, you know, I sit on a few boards myself. I think there is this piece that we really need to encourage boards to take the level of risk that is going to be necessary for us to embrace the change that we need. And if you look at the average person on a board, they were the people that were the CEOs of these organisations a while ago. And so there is a little bit of a piece in there is, are you board ready to change your organisation or to change your way of thinking? It's not just about management. And, you know, as we all know, boards are very risk adverse in general. Yeah.
I think that's a good moment for me to mention that Women in Aid and Development now has a board. We're incorporated and all the rest. And we have a board observer program. If anyone is thinking they want to get onto a board, particularly if you're in the sector, you can come along and be an observer. You can talk to Chris, our chair, about that. Thanks, that's the end of the ad. Any other questions right now, or do I get to have another one?
Hey, Michelle. Hi. Okay, my name's Ashley Brady. I'm actually from the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, but I formerly worked in development. I guess I don't know if it's a question, might be a bit left field. I guess it's acknowledging the change since COVID that a lot of people that have worked internationally have come domestically. That was certainly the case for me, particularly considering a lot of the crises domestically that we've been combating. A lot of the humanitarian expertise was really crucial. And I personally have that lived experience, and a lot of my colleagues have found the same. I guess we're kind of navigating a new, well, maybe not new, but different aid sector environment where there's a lot of expertise that's being required domestically as well. I think we've kind of, a lot of the developed countries think that we're somehow past addressing community development needs and actually looking at that. And I think COVID and the disasters Australia has recently experienced has exposed that. And I guess, yeah, how do we kind of reframe the way that we look at aid and development to kind of ensure that it's a more collaborative space? Like, I know that myself, I'm trying to initiate that in our organisation, trying to work more with international organisations. And it's definitely challenging because, especially in Australia, they kind of are excluded in the domestic space. Like, our committees, this is maybe oversharing, but our committees looking at like the State Emergency Committee does, like we have Red Cross and Vinnies and that's it. Like we don't really look at the kind of, that's something I've observed from my observation, I want to clarify to people watching online. I'm sure other states do it better, but in New South Wales, it's something we need to improve is our collaboration and partnership with international organisations and recognising the strength and intelligence that an international organisation brings. And everyone's really overburdened with trying to develop partnerships and anyway, but I don't know if that was a question, but I think it's just an interesting observation I had, and I wondered what your experience was as kind of having that national perspective.
Thank you. Such an interesting observation.
I know, I wish I had a notepad. There was quite a few things in there, wasn't there? No. It was great. It was really good. And, you know, it's interesting. I know your experience is not in isolation, and even at Caritas we had a number of people during COVID who took that similar path for a number of reasons, and many people who are in our sector, and COVID made them rethink, do they want to be away from their families and travelling as much as they used to, and all of those sort of COVID questions. So it is an interesting experience, and I think the first part of my answer is, I think more broadly as a sector, aid and development sector, but also I think more broadly as a service sector in Australia, there's a lot we could learn about better partnership, right? And there's a lot that we could learn about experiences between both the domestic and the international setting. And it's certainly one that we have our own struggles and internal conversations about. I don't necessarily have the solution, except for I think you are the solution. And I had said this to a recent person at Caritas who also left to do a similar thing. Like, the solution is about people to people, because somebody in a domestic organisation who was once at an international one starts to make those connections. And it's normally through people that these conversations begin. And so I think it's about utilising what you know and what others know, and starting the conversation. I guess for me, I always think about it from a learning perspective. So, you know, is there a piece in there about joint evaluations or joint reflections at the end of disasters, where it would be interesting to see the way, you know, Australia responded to a flood versus Bangladesh? And, you know, are there some interesting things in those spaces? I'm not aware of anyone who's doing them right now, so maybe there's an opportunity. Anyone online that's got funding, speak to Ashley.
Jess, I think you had another question. Was it someone else at the back? Please.
Hi, I'm Michelle as well. Michelle Ju from Women in Aid and Development. My background is from the corporate sector, so it's not really a question as well, kind of some observations. In the corporate sector, when we want to do anything agile, we have a separate investments team, a task force. So is that a possibility, instead of, so people can do their day job and then you have a dedicated team of 2 or 5, whatever the capacity is? That's one. And so that's in terms of capability and capacity. The second thing is, if there is the lack of know-how to get out of what you're familiar with, is there a market for a BCG consulting type thing where they come in and do teachings or help work for your supply chain and identify the pain points and help create efficiencies? Maybe you don't need to do that report in 6 months. You can do it in a different time frame.
Last question first. Money. So yes, you can buy in obviously any skill that you want, but in the sector where we work in, and particularly an organisation like Caritas, where our number one objective is always to get the most money we can overseas, you know, you work in a fiscally tight environment. And so you know, I think there are always questions about how you use, you know, your money and to invest in those sorts of things. And certainly at Caritas at the moment, we've brought in people to try and upskill us in innovation, because we realise that's a skill that we need to buy in for the moment. But your first question is a really interesting one. And certainly, you know, if you look across our sector and even at Caritas, I think that's what's being built at the moment, which is essentially separate departments, or in some cases, separate offshoot organisations that are wholly about this space. And I think that ticks one box, but perhaps not my box. So I think that's part of the story. But I think there's another piece about being more agile and innovative in our core business as we see it now as well. And the question for me is, how do you marry both of those together? But I think back to your point, which is really my point, which is I think we do have a lot to learn from the corporate space about how to do this differently, and we're certainly all trying. And then my next point is, it's really hard to get startup capital in this space to start thinking about these things. And so I think there's a piece in there for us to work with philanthropy teams who are willing to be in that seeding part of these projects or these ideas, because that's really high risk space and still quite difficult. Yeah. And then I would say I've never worked in a company, so I have no idea. 25 years in aid and development, but you know, that's my peering over the fence comment about corporations.
Actually, I'm going to follow on from that with a question, since we seem to have gone down the road of talking about innovation. You're saying that, as you just mentioned again, you've had a bit of a chance to peek over the fence into some other areas of work. You've said you perceive that the sector in Australia is perhaps starting to creep back into some of its old ways. Particularly because you're part of this global confederation as well, are there other areas of the sector, particularly overseas, where you've thought, I don't know if it's necessarily to do with the culture of a country, but have you thought that country seems to do things well, or I really like what they've come up with in this part of the sector, I'd like us to consider taking on that model or a way of thinking, or something that you've seen that at least you've thought would be interesting, even if, as you said, implementing it is always that little bit harder?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, where we really look to our partners, because I think during COVID, we saw something really interesting take place. And I think, Michelle, you and I were having the start of this conversation before, which is our partners were actually fine without us. Pretty dramatic bit of information for many of us, right? And not only were they fine, but they started doing some really interesting things. And so I think for us as organisations, now's the time for us, and certainly for us at Caritas, we've seen some of our, in particular, larger partners in Southeast Asia really get into some interesting space, particularly around alternative financing, but also around program delivery and program objectives. Very different to the sort of things that we were working with on them pre-COVID times. And so for me, it's less about looking at other sort of funding Caritases and more looking at the implementers and looking at some of the things. And that's certainly for us as an organisation at Caritas Australia, where I think the next bit of the learning in the chapter is what can we learn from our partners in this space.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Emily, and I work for PALMS Australia. And you spoke about like the most impactful projects are the ones that have the least money or no money. And I just want to know if you've got any examples, or if you could talk a bit more about that, please.
Yeah, I think it starts with this value of relationship and this value of being in partnership with someone. And, you know, I think this is, over the years, we've probably seen quite a number of evaluations of partnership in the sector and us trying to sort of describe the value add of that. And so there is most certainly this piece with partners, many of whom now in many countries in the world don't necessarily need our money because they've got their own income generation coming in, but they still do value our partnership. So a good example for us is projects or work that we do in India at the moment, and one of my colleagues was just over there, where, you know, the partner's getting money from other organisations. The value or the way that they're accelerating the impact of that is actually through their relationship with us. And so through us, they have open dialogue, ability to ask questions when things are going wrong. So because there's no money involved, there's a real honesty in the conversation. Because there's no leverage, there's no power dynamic that's being caused by money. And as a result of that, there's these incremental improvements that then can result in greater impact. And so I think that's an interesting reflection, and particularly an interesting reflection for us in some of the countries where we work, where there is increasingly domestic money available. And so we begin to ask ourselves, well, what's the value of the work that we're adding into that space? Where's our value?
Such a good reflection. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, making me work for it. Right up the back. Okay.
My name's Sarah. I'm also from Caritas. I guess I wanted to speak to your maybe unique position of womanhood, but also motherhood. You mentioned that you received some comments on your womanhood when you received the position of CEO, but what about your motherhood as someone who had a young child and still a young child? What kind of comments you receive, or just feedback, I guess, of when you travel or even just working in development field as in general? Would be my question.
I've had all that time for her to walk and I'm still slightly panicking with the question. Really, really good question. I guess my first question is, and you know, I think always as a mother anyway, or this is my experience of a mother, is you feel somewhat judged because of the decisions that you've made. So I guess I start by saying that in some ways I've chosen a certain way of parenting that may not be everyone's cup of tea. And part of that is I chose to always travel with my child when he was young. So as I said, he was 5.5 months when he first went to Timor. And so I spent a lot of those first years of his life. I didn't take maternity leave. I was out for about maybe a day without my laptop. And then, you know, I think I had about 6 weeks. And then I was a bit like, yeah, I'm not a stay-at-home mum. I can see this. And so, you know, I think for me, motherhood is also about mehood, and is about bringing my whole self to being a mother, as well as me bringing my whole self to work. And I don't think we necessarily do that well. I don't do that well. And, you know, as an organisation, I keep questioning, can we do that better? But I think the only way we do that better is by letting everyone embrace motherhood or fatherhood in the way that they want to, and trying our best to be open to those ideas. Our sector, I guess, is a tricky one to be a parent, you know, mother, father, whatever, but being a parent and travelling makes our sector really hard. And I think there's a certain space, particularly for CEOs who are parents, to verbalise that it's hard. And, you know, it's a juggle for all of us. And I think when our leaders pretend that it's not overly helpful. So I don't know if that answers your question, because I guess, yeah, I rarely compartmentalise myself in you know, as mother, as woman, as CEO as, you know, whatever, and try and instead say, how can we embrace our wholeness in all of those aspects. But, you know, really interesting journey. And, you know, my son's now in year 1. I think I'm on about the 4th form for school of like, can I take him overseas? And, you know, I'm sure there's going to come a point where the school's like, no. But, you know, and I'll try for as long as I can, because I think it's really important for him and, you know, the way he views the world. But I think it's also really important for me and, you know, I hope the environment that we can create, in the sector more broadly to say, you know, kids are okay. And if you don't have kids, that's okay too. You know, it's a space for everyone. Yeah.
I think we're winding towards the end of our time together tonight. So I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll take a final one or two before we wind up. I think we have quite a few younger colleagues here tonight, and I won't assume that younger means necessarily that they have not yet been in leadership or management, which are definitely different things. But what advice would you have to them or to anyone who is looking to move into leadership or management in the sector?
So much advice. Let's sit down. Exactly. A few things, and maybe carrying on from the last question. I think the best piece of advice I was ever given, and interestingly, I read it recently when I read that Sheryl Sandberg book again. What's it called? Leaning In. When I did a reread. Interesting to do a reread when you're a bit older. But I think the best piece of advice I was ever given was to keep pushing forward in your career if you do aspire to senior management and leadership, until you don't want to anymore. And I think a good example of that is when I first started to think about having children, I decided to back away from leadership or management, I would have spent a decade going, oh, I'm just here, you know, doing this easy job because, you know, this is going to happen tomorrow and whatever else. So I think it was a really good piece of advice to say, just keep leaning in, just keep pushing forward until you don't want to anymore, until you're like, you know what, this feels about where I want to be in an organisation. And I think the second piece of advice is leadership is not for everyone. And, you know, being successful isn't necessarily about being the leader or the CEO, and I think this is something I, you know, wish somebody told me, maybe a bit late. But, you know, I think you can be really successful and really competent at what you're doing, and that won't necessarily mean you are in leadership, and that's okay. And I think it's important for us to have a space for people to flourish and be their best selves without being the head of the organisation. And then I think finally, one of the things that's really benefited me over the years is just the diversity of the roles that I've held. And so by that I mean, even though I've only ever worked in the NGO sector, I've literally worked probably in every department except for the HR department. But I like to consider myself an HR expert anyway. You know, I think that really helped. Having worked in fundraising, knowing how that worked in communications, worked in programs, worked in advocacy, it gives you that breadth of knowledge, and particularly the further up you move in the organisation, the broader your breadth of knowledge, the more advantageous. And so often, you know, I have people who've worked 20 years in programs trying to move into higher leadership, and I'm like, but where's your fundraising skills? So, you know, I think trying to get that breadth of experience is really important as well.
Okay, do we have some final questions for Kirsty? If not, we are going to socialise a little afterwards. You can feel free to ask them in person.
Thanks so much, Kirsty and Michelle. It's been great. So my name is Natasha. I'm from Caritas Australia as well. I just wanted to know a bit if you had any sort of advice or tips on perhaps young people and in some instances, young women who are perhaps navigating that space of trying to be in the workplace, be assertive, sort of develop themselves, but in some instances receive a bit of that pushback when they are being assertive or being, in some of that kind of, those sort of themes.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And to be honest, I ask myself that question all the time, and I can see some, so you ask it from a perspective of a younger person, but I can see many older people, sorry to call you older, but I'm calling myself older as well, nodding here, because I think that's just the reality. You know, I think what I find firstly is thick skin. So, you know, I think really important to know who you are, the value that you add, and own that. And, you know, and thereby be really comfortable in being able to voice opinion or to sort of lean into a space. I'm going to assume, although I might be wrongly assuming, that you are inferring men, but you might be inferring older people as well, I'm not sure. You know, I think with regards to the men piece, I spend a reasonable amount of my time around men who are used to either mansplaining things or giving advice that I didn't ask for. And so, you know, I think I've learned two things over the years. The first one is, I think in general, they come from a good place. And if I can just remember that as I'm listening, it often sort of sets me in the right place to then be able to offer some sort of pushback, you know. So I think firstly, just acknowledging in general, I don't think people, men in particular, intentionally do that. There are obviously exceptions. And then, you know, and then secondly, I think it's really important to be assertive and just to say, yeah, to lean into that, to find your voice. And yeah, and if it's not acknowledged, you just keep trying again tomorrow. Yeah, and you know, someday I think you'll suddenly become aware of the fact that people are listening. So yeah.
And practice makes, well, if not perfect, then... Any final questions for Kirsty? All right, we're going to have those questions in person over a drink. So that seems like a good place for us to wrap up tonight's conversation. Please join me in thanking Kirsty for her contributions. And we'd like to show our appreciation to her with a small gift. Are we doing that? Yes, a Women in Aid and Development coffee mug. Yeah, which Chris is going to send. Chris is going to send you later. It's fine.
This is the virtual gift.
We'll show you a photo on the internet later. Yep. Well, trust me, it's great. You'll have the best looking coffee in the office, and everyone will want one. And we hope to see you and your coffee mug and your colleagues again here in the future. I'd also like to thank the rest of the Women in Aid and Development leadership team who've been here tonight helping or who've been working up to tonight to make this happen, in particular Chris, our chair, who always brings all this together. So please connect with us online, either on our website, which is womeninaiddevelopment.com, or just Google us, on Facebook or on LinkedIn. We'd also encourage you, there are some forms up the back. Write us a thought and give us your details for our Women in Aid Wednesday that goes on LinkedIn. We can talk to you about it more, and as I said, grab a form up the back. You'll be the first to know about future events if you join our mailing list, and if you choose, you can become a member, which helps us financially and means you can also join in our mentorship program if you so desire. Our next event will be on Tuesday the 16th of May. It'll be on the topic of peace building, and there'll be more details to follow. But for now, thank you for being here. Let's enjoy more food and wine and each other's company. Thanks so much.